If you're like me, you end up with loads of packaging material after Christmas, but rather than throw it all away, I'm going to turn it into some great looking Warhammer terrain. In this video, I'm going to show you how I turned this waste into three things: a ramp, perfect as a modular piece to add to buildings, a generator complete with walkway and control panel, and a dingy sunken dive bar covered in rusty corrugated metal. Let's get started. My starting point was this packaging from a puzzle I received. It came with a thin plastic sheet which I kept for future projects, as I thought it would be perfect for making glass. And although the outer box then had a large hole in it, it provided plenty of cardboard for cutting up for use across this project. The ramp though was what really drew my eye, because it was perfect as, well, a ramp. I trimmed down the end so it was all flush, and then hot glued the sides in place. This gave the ramp some stability, but the back was open, and so I took a sheet of spare card, which I hot glued to the back of the ramp and then trimmed to be flush also. At this point the ramp was solid, but I didn't like the raw edge where the sides were glued together, so I hot glued some thin coffee stir sticks in place. When these are painted, they won't look like wood but metal support struts. Once these were in place, I could trim them easily with a pair of pliers. To decorate the surface of the ramp, I turned to an old favourite of mine, plasterer's tape, which looks exactly like mesh grating. It's self-adhesive, so I just lay down a strip and cut it flush with some scissors, and then did the same thing on the other side for symmetry. To add some more detail, I then turned to the packaging from some biscuits we had over Christmas, as the interior packaging of things like this always has a lot of interesting detail that passes really easily as metal sheeting. I just cut out some panels and then glued these in place down the centre of the ramp, using PVA rather than hot glue, as this would just melt the thin plastic. Using some more coffee stir sticks, I added some more strips down either side of the centre, both for detail and to hide the raw edges of the tape, and also measured some smaller strips which I glued to the top and bottom edges of the ramp. Again, as well as being decorative, this hides the edges, and so adds some more protection to the piece for when it's being used and moved around. On the biscuit packaging was this interesting bit that I thought looked a bit like a serial number, which I also decided to glue to the ramp because I guess in the far future ramps might also have serial numbers. Next, I took some scraps of spare packaging card and the corrugated card from a coffee sleeve and stuck these down to act as debris and clutter. And finally, I turned to my secret weapon, nail beads. These are fantastic for acting as rivets, and are self-adhesive, so I just stuck a series at regular distances across all of the coffee stir sticks. This has the added advantage of further hiding the original wooden appearance of these sticks. And with that done, I was really happy with how the main body of the ramp was looking. The sides were a bit bare, however, so I used some more scraps of textured card and stir sticks to further detail these areas. I also used some vertical strips to add more detailing. As a general rule, with homemade terrain, the more little details the better for hiding the original materials and shapes. With a final application of nail beads, the ramp was finished and ready to put aside. My next terrain piece used this packaging. I honestly can't remember what was in it now, but the shape was so interesting that I knew I had to make use of it. And luckily, it was in two halves, which meant two pieces of terrain. I cut them apart and put one to the side for now, and then cut around the other to leave the edges flat and flush with the tabletop. Looking at the shape of this, it really screamed generator to me, and I imagined the central section filled with pulsating coils. To achieve this, I used some spare wire, which I just eyeballed to the right length and then cut with scissors, using the first piece as a guide for others until I had enough pieces. You'll see in a minute that eyeballing this was a big mistake, but that's a problem for future Ben. Well, imminent Ben. Once cut, I hot glued each strip of wire in place one by one. There we go. As you can see, somehow I made a pig's ear of the measurements, and so I want to hide these untidy looking edges. To do this, I just measured the height I wanted and cut some card to size, and then further cut this into 6 panels that could cover each of the exposed central sections. It was then just a case of hot gluing these in place, and using yet more nail beads as rivets. It's not the neatest job ever, and I'm not hugely happy with it, but once some more details are added to the piece and it's painted up, nobody will notice. I then turned to another form of packaging I got a lot of this Christmas, and every Christmas: sprues. As I was cutting out the models, I kept back some pieces of sprue that had particularly interesting shapes, and when looking through the pile, saw these pieces that looked perfectly like the supports for a walkway. Very serendipitous, I thought, and I had 2. So I just measured where they would slot into the packaging, used a drill to make a pilot hole, which I widened with a file, and then hot glued the 2 supports in place. I then measured the length and width of this, and cut some card to size to act as the walkway. I envisaged this as a T-shape, with one slightly wider end where I would put some sort of control panel or mechanism doohickey. I cut this out, and then within this shape measured an inner section, leaving about half a centimetre from the edge all the way around. I used these inner dimensions to cut out some further shapes, beveled the edges slightly, and then glued these onto the first sheet. This way, these would act as panels and add some more visual interest to the walkway, as well as make it thicker and therefore more durable. Once all of these additional panels were glued in place, I gave this a good while to dry, weighing it heavily down with some books, because PVA and card can warp as it dries if left unweighted. And there we are, dry, flat, and once again beaded. Now the reason I left an exposed edge is because I plan to add some railings around the edge. I tend to use my terrain for Necromunda, and so things like this are useful for adding some easy partial cover. I returned to my sprues and cut out some further bits that could act as the railings, and that I would attach once everything was painted. I also found this slightly wider bit, which was perfectly shaped to act as an end piece. Whilst looking through my bits box, I also found this access panel or hatch, which again seemed too serendipitous not to use, so I glued it in place. I also grabbed some bits of pipe from a children's toy set, again to add more detailing around the body of the generator. For the control mechanism, I found this good-sized little piece which, having realised I glued the hatch to the wrong end of the walkway, I put in the right place. I used some more nail beads of various sizes and shapes to act as a set of buttons on the mechanism, and with that done, the second terrain feature was finished. For the third and final piece, the shape of this really made me envisage some sort of barrel-roofed sunken dive bar, where the inside was below ground level. I wanted to surround the outside with a corrugated metal awning, and so making use of the 3 central struts on the body of this packaging, I cut some skewers into equal lengths and made some holes that I could push these through to support the awning, hot gluing them in place from the inside. For the awnings, I cut some rectangles of packing card, and then covered these with lots of offcuts of the same corrugated coffee sleeve card, as if they'd just been piled up haphazardly to form some shade. This card is so good for acting as corrugated metal. I keep a large stack on hand at all times. Again, I glued these in place, and then weighted the card down whilst it dried. The short ends of this packaging made quite convincing entranceways that I imagine led down some steep steps underground, but I wanted to cover their roofs, and so I did a similar thing here, measuring some squares of card that I covered with corrugated strips in the same way. Once everything was painted, I would assemble all of these pieces together. My sprues also gave me these pieces, that I realised would perfectly suit as further supports for the awnings, adding some more structural integrity. So again, I just glued these in place, at the right height to support the awnings. Then, I finished by adding further detail in the form of scraps of plastic tubing, some more pipes from the toy set, and some cut hair ties which work great as cables. I just worked out roughly where I wanted them to lie and then superglued them in place, which has the added benefit of seeping into the fabric and making them rock hard. And with that done, all 3 terrain pieces were assembled and ready to paint, alongside the smaller components that I would assemble later. All the card pieces began by getting a coat of trusty Mod Podge, but you can use a mixture of PVA, black craft paint and water instead. The purpose of this is partly to undercoat, but more to seal the card. My terrain painting style is quite wash heavy, and so I wanted to seal the card as much as possible before it got wet. I just splodged this on and waited for it to dry, and then spray base coated all of the areas that will be metal with a dark brown paint, before giving them a heavy overbrush with a cheap silver craft paint. You don't need to use expensive paints for this. I then coated all of the metal with my patented orange rust wash, which is just simply yellow and red craft paints mixed with water. I always have a large jar of this on standby. I quite simply coated everything heavily with this. It looks quite stark now, but dries darker and more subtle. To add some chipping, I took some liquid masking fluid and sponged it over all of the corrugated metal sheets, and once that was dry, I took some Necromunda approved colours and painted the individual sheets. Then, with an old toothbrush, I rubbed at the card to remove the masking fluid and reveal the dark rust colours beneath. These exposed areas then got a second, more targeted wash with my orange mix. I then painted all of the additional details, cables and the absolutely necessary hazard stripes across the terrain, as well as the buttons on the control panel for the generator. I then painted the other areas concrete. I won't go into detail how I did that here, but if you're interested in my approach, I explain further in my previous terrain making video, which you can find here. With the painting done, all that was left was to assemble the various parts, and we were done. And there we are, Christmas waste packaging made into 3 pieces of terrain. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and maybe it's inspired you to recycle your own waste. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. I have lots more painting and terrain making videos on my channel. And leave me a comment if there's something you'd like me to paint next. Or maybe even consider becoming a member, where you can get early access to all my forthcoming videos, as well as exclusive, members-only shorts and tutorials. In any case, thank you very much, and I'll see you next time. And until then, happy painting.